That speech was never yours. The sentence exploded across the luxury Manhattan ballroom so suddenly that even the soft piano music near the stage seemed to disappear beneath the crushing silence that followed. Hundreds of wealthy guests turned at once beneath the crystal chandeliers, while camera flashes froze against polished marble walls and giant rain-covered windows overlooking the storm-dark skyline outside. Vanessa Brooks stood beside the stage, gripping the microphone with trembling fingers, while every heartbeat inside her chest felt painfully loud beneath the golden ballroom lighting. Her black waitress uniform suddenly felt heavier than ever under the eyes of investors, celebrities, journalists, and politicians staring at her like she had violated an invisible rule carved into the foundation of the room itself. Across from her, billionaire philanthropist Charles Whitmore remained standing behind the glowing podium, where only seconds earlier the crowd had applauded his emotional charity speech about perseverance, sacrifice, and human compassion. He looked directly at Vanessa with calm blue eyes sharpened by irritation, hiding beneath decades of carefully practiced public composure. For years, Charles Whitmore had mastered rooms exactly like this one. Grand ballrooms, television cameras, wealthy donors, emotional speeches polished enough to make strangers cry before writing enormous checks. Men like him understood that power often depended less on truth and more on presentation. And tonight had been planned perfectly from the beginning. The charity gala occupied the entire upper floor of one of Manhattan's most expensive hotels, while silver rain slid continuously down giant glass walls surrounding the ballroom. Waiters moved silently between marble tables carrying champagne beneath crystal chandeliers, while journalists documented every smiling handshake beneath warm gold lighting reflecting across polished floors and luxury floral displays. Vanessa was never supposed to matter inside rooms like this. She was supposed to refill glasses quietly, carry trays silently, disappear before important people noticed her face long enough to remember it. Instead, she now stood directly beneath the spotlight, holding a microphone in front of one of the most powerful men in New York. Charles slowly stepped away from the podium while maintaining the calm public smile expected from a billionaire surrounded by cameras. "Excuse me," he said evenly enough for nearby tables to hear. "I believe there has been some misunderstanding." Soft, nervous laughter moved through parts of the ballroom, while guests exchanged uncomfortable glances beneath the chandelier reflections. Vanessa swallowed hard while trying to steady her breathing. Security guards had already started moving somewhere through the crowd toward the stage. She could feel it without turning around. But the memory inside her mind refused to disappear now. Earlier that evening, while organizing catering trays backstage near the service corridor, Vanessa accidentally overheard Charles rehearsing the speech with his assistant before guests arrived. At first, she barely listened while polishing champagne glasses beneath fluorescent hallway lights. Then Charles laughed softly and said something that stopped her cold. "The donors will love this one," he said casually while flipping through pages of the speech. Daniel Reed always knew how to make rich people cry. Vanessa remembered freezing beside the catering station while rain hammered against backstage windows. Daniel Reed, the former Whitmore Foundation employee who died years earlier after quietly disappearing from public view. Vanessa recognized the name because she once read one of Daniel's unpublished essays during college while studying journalism before financial hardship forced her to leave school. The words Charles delivered tonight were almost identical. Same emotional structure, same phrasing, same memories presented as if they belonged personally to Charles Whitmore himself. Vanessa spent the entire evening carrying silver trays between investors while listening to wealthy strangers praise the billionaire's honesty and humanity. Every applause felt heavier. Every smile felt false. And now beneath the giant chandeliers while rain shimmered against the Manhattan skyline outside, she finally forced herself to speak again. "You told everyone this speech came from your own life," she said quietly into the microphone. But Daniel Reed wrote those words. The ballroom immediately exploded into whispers beneath the gold ballroom light. Charles remained calm on the surface, but the muscles near his jaw tightened visibly for the first time all evening. "Miss Brooks," he replied smoothly, "this is neither the time nor place for confusion." Confusion. The word landed sharply inside Vanessa's chest because she understood exactly what he meant. A waitress was not supposed to challenge a billionaire publicly. especially not a black waitress standing alone inside a ballroom filled with powerful white strangers already deciding whether she belonged there at all. Charles lowered his voice slightly while stepping closer toward her beneath the stage lights. "Return to work," he said softly enough that only nearby guests fully heard him. "Before this becomes embarrassing for you." Vanessa felt heat rise painfully into her face beneath the cameras now pointed directly toward her from every direction. For one terrifying second, she nearly handed the microphone back, nearly apologized, nearly disappeared into silence again. Then suddenly the microphone crackled violently in her hands. Sharp static screamed through the ballroom speakers before the entire sound system abruptly died. Complete silence swallowed the room instantly. No music, no applause. Only rain striking the giant Manhattan windows while hundreds of wealthy strangers stared at the black waitress standing beside the billionaire beneath the frozen ballroom lights. The silence inside the ballroom felt almost unbearable after the microphone died. Hundreds of wealthy guests remained frozen beneath the crystal chandeliers, while silver rain continued sliding down the giant Manhattan windows surrounding the charity gala high above the city streets below. Vanessa Brooks stood beside the stage gripping the useless microphone with trembling fingers, while every eye inside the room remained locked onto her beneath the warm golden lighting reflecting across marble floors and untouched champagne glasses. Charles Whitmore slowly stepped away from the podium with the calm, measured movements of a man who had spent decades surviving public pressure without allowing emotion to crack visibly across his face. But Vanessa noticed the difference immediately now. The billionaire's smile no longer reached his eyes. Irritation and calculation moved beneath the polished expression he still wore for cameras and investors surrounding the ballroom. Nearby journalists whispered urgently while lowering phones toward one another beneath the chandelier reflections. Some guests looked uncomfortable. Others looked fascinated. But nobody looked away anymore. Charles turned toward the audience first before addressing Vanessa again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said evenly despite the dead sound system forcing him to raise his voice slightly. "Please excuse this unfortunate misunderstanding." The sentence drifted across the ballroom beneath the steady sound of rain striking glass. Vanessa could feel security staff slowly moving closer through the crowd now, weaving carefully between marble tables covered in floral arrangements and auction brochures. Her chest tightened painfully. She never imagined things would go this far. Earlier that evening, she only wanted someone else to hear the truth she accidentally overheard backstage. She never expected to become the center of the room herself. Charles stepped closer toward her beneath the stage lights while maintaining the calm public tone expected from a billionaire philanthropist. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly enough for only nearby tables to hear clearly, "you are creating a scene that will damage nobody except yourself." Vanessa swallowed hard while trying to steady her breathing. The pressure surrounding her felt suffocating now. Wealthy strangers stared at her with the same uncomfortable mixture of judgment and curiosity she experienced constantly while serving elite guests at the hotel. She knew those looks well. Some saw her as entertainment. Some saw her as a problem. Most saw her as someone who crossed a line she was never supposed to approach. Charles lowered his voice further. "You are tired," he continued calmly. "You misunderstood part of a rehearsal conversation and chose the worst possible moment to interrupt a charity event helping thousands of people." The sentence hit hard because it sounded reasonable, carefully reasonable. Vanessa felt embarrassment rising into her face beneath the spotlight, while cameras continued turning toward her from every direction. For one terrifying moment, she questioned herself completely. Maybe nobody would believe her. Maybe the entire ballroom already decided she was simply an emotional waitress looking for attention. Then suddenly one of the hidden ballroom speakers crackled overhead. Sharp static burst through the room, so violently several guests flinched beneath the chandelier light. The sound technicians near the ballroom wall looked immediately confused while adjusting controls frantically beside glowing equipment consoles. Another burst of static echoed through the ballroom. Then, unexpectedly, a recording began playing through the giant overhead speakers. Charles Whitmore's voice filled the room instantly. Clear, relaxed, undeniable. "Daniel Reed always wrote the emotional material better than I could," the recording said casually while the ballroom froze again beneath the sound of rain striking glass outside. Vanessa lifted her head slowly while shock moved visibly through the crowd. Charles turned pale beneath the stage lights almost instantly. The recording continued. Honestly, donors do not care who originally wrote it. They care about the feeling. Gasps spread across the ballroom, while journalists immediately raised phones toward the stage again. One investor lowered her champagne glass onto the marble table with shaking fingers, while another whispered softly, "That cannot be real." But everyone knew it was. The voice was unmistakable. Charles Whitmore stood motionless near the podium, while hearing his own private backstage rehearsal echo across the ballroom he controlled only minutes earlier. The recording continued through the hidden speakers overhead. People donate more when they think pain made you humble. Complete silence followed the final sentence. No music returned afterward. No applause. Only rain against the giant Manhattan windows and the heavy breathing of wealthy strangers realizing they had just witnessed the collapse of a carefully manufactured image in real time. Vanessa slowly lowered the dead microphone in her hands while staring toward Charles beneath the chandelier reflections. For the first time all evening, the billionaire no longer looked powerful. He looked exposed. The ballroom remained trapped in silence long after the recording ended. Nobody reached for applause anymore. Nobody smiled beneath the crystal chandeliers reflecting warm gold light across marble floors and untouched champagne glasses. Rain continued sliding slowly down the giant Manhattan windows surrounding the charity gala, while Charles Whitmore stood near the podium looking at the crowd with the expression of a man realizing control had disappeared faster than he could recover it. Vanessa Brooks remained beside the stage, still gripping the dead microphone, while journalists moved closer through the ballroom, carrying phones and cameras beneath the glow of chandelier reflections. Earlier that evening, the same reporters barely noticed her while she carried silver trays between wealthy donors. Now every camera in the room pointed directly toward her face. Charles finally inhaled slowly before speaking again without amplification. "The recording is incomplete," he said carefully while forcing calm back into his voice. Daniel Reed contributed research and language ideas over the years. That is normal inside philanthropic organizations. His words sounded measured and intelligent, but something underneath them felt weaker now. The room could hear it too. Wealthy guests exchanged uncertain glances while investors leaned toward one another beneath the ballroom lighting. The invisible protection surrounding Charles Whitmore earlier that night had begun cracking apart. Vanessa could physically feel the difference inside the room. People no longer looked at Charles automatically for reassurance. They looked at him for answers. Across the ballroom, Olivia Bennett slowly rose from her chair near the front donor tables. The respected investor stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier light, while dozens of guests immediately turned toward her. Olivia had funded Whitmore Foundation projects for nearly a decade. Her opinion mattered inside rooms like this more than most politicians. Did Daniel Reed ever receive public credit for those speeches? She asked calmly. The question floated across the silent ballroom, while rain tapped softly against the towering windows behind the stage. Charles paused briefly before answering. Daniel preferred privacy. Several journalists immediately began typing notes beneath the ballroom lights. Olivia continued watching him carefully. That is not what I asked. More silence spread through the room. Vanessa felt her pulse pounding harder again while standing alone beside the stage in her black waitress uniform, surrounded by million-dollar gowns and designer tuxedos. She still felt out of place beneath every staring eye inside the ballroom. Yet for the first time all night, she no longer felt invisible. Charles clasped his hands together calmly while adjusting his posture toward the audience. Tonight was supposed to support children's education programs, he replied smoothly. I think we are losing sight of the larger purpose because of a misunderstanding created by someone overhearing fragments of a private conversation backstage. Someone. Not Vanessa. Not a person. Just someone. The sentence landed sharply inside the ballroom because everybody understood exactly what he was doing now. Shrinking her. Reducing her importance. Returning her socially to where he believed she belonged. Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly toward the microphone still hanging uselessly in her hand, while humiliation burned quietly beneath her skin. She suddenly became aware again of every detail separating her from the people surrounding her. The tired service shoes hurting her feet after a double shift. the small stain near the edge of her apron pocket. The fact that she would take the subway home tonight, while most people inside this room left in black luxury SUVs waiting outside the hotel entrance. Charles noticed her hesitation immediately. Powerful men always recognized moments of weakness. "Miss Brooks," he said gently now, almost sympathetically, "I understand this situation may feel emotional for you." Emotional? The word cut deeper than anger would have. Vanessa looked up slowly beneath the ballroom lights while several guests shifted uncomfortably after hearing it. Charles continued speaking calmly toward the audience. But accusations made publicly without context can permanently damage lives and organizations helping thousands of people. For a brief moment the room seemed uncertain again. Vanessa felt it instantly. The billionaire was rebuilding control piece by piece using tone, status, and confidence. She opened her mouth to respond, but suddenly another voice interrupted from near the center tables. "Actually," Michael Turner said while standing slowly beneath the chandeliers, "there is context." Every head turned toward the senior journalist immediately. Michael lifted his phone slightly while looking directly at Charles. "Because several reporters recorded the ballroom speakers when your rehearsal confession played." The room froze again. Charles said nothing. Michael took another slow step forward. "And one more thing," he added quietly. "I knew Daniel Reed personally." Complete silence swallowed the ballroom beneath the rain and chandelier light, while Vanessa stared at Michael in shock. Across the stage, Charles Whitmore's face tightened for the first time all night in a way cameras could no longer mistake for composure. The ballroom grew so quiet after Michael Turner spoke that even the sound of rain against the towering Manhattan windows seemed sharper beneath the crystal chandeliers. Vanessa Brooks stood motionless beside the stage, still gripping the dead microphone, while hundreds of wealthy guests stared between the senior journalist and Charles Whitmore beneath the warm gold reflections dancing across marble floors and untouched champagne glasses. Michael adjusted his glasses slowly before taking another step forward through the center aisle, separating the donor tables. "Daniel Reed was one of the most talented speechwriters I ever interviewed," he said calmly, while cameras immediately turned toward him from every direction. He believed words were supposed to help people honestly. That mattered to him. Charles remained near the podium with both hands clasped carefully in front of him, while his expression tightened almost invisibly beneath the ballroom lighting. The billionaire still looked composed on the surface, but Vanessa noticed something new inside his eyes now. Not anger. Fear. Small. Controlled. But real. Michael continued speaking while several journalists around him quietly began recording again. "3 years ago, Daniel contacted me privately before he disappeared from public events entirely," Michael said. He claimed his work inside the Whitmore Foundation was constantly presented publicly under someone else's name. Soft whispers spread immediately across the ballroom beneath the chandelier reflections. Investors exchanged uneasy glances while staff members near the walls stood completely frozen, holding silver trays and folded linen napkins. Vanessa could feel the social balance inside the room shifting again. Earlier that evening, the ballroom moved like a machine designed entirely around Charles Whitmore. Every smile, every speech, every round of applause existed to strengthen his image. Now the same room felt unstable beneath him. Charles finally stepped away from the podium and faced Michael directly. "You are making assumptions based on partial information," he replied evenly while maintaining his public composure. Daniel struggled emotionally during his final years. Many people inside the organization tried to support him. Vanessa immediately noticed several guests lowering their eyes after hearing that sentence. The billionaire had changed strategies now, no longer denying Daniel completely, reframing him instead, weakening him, turning him into someone unstable enough that his truth could be questioned safely. Michael seemed to notice the same thing. "Daniel struggled because nobody respected his work," he answered quietly. "Not because he lacked talent." Complete silence swallowed the ballroom again. Vanessa felt chills move across her skin despite the warm temperature inside the hotel. The rain outside had intensified now, sliding heavily across the massive glass walls surrounding the ballroom, while distant thunder rolled softly over Manhattan. Charles inhaled slowly before turning toward the audience again beneath the stage lights. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "my foundation has funded hospitals, scholarships, and shelters across this country for over 20 years. I hope one unfortunate misunderstanding tonight does not erase the good we have accomplished together. The sentence landed carefully inside the room because it appealed directly to guilt. Vanessa watched several donors shift uncomfortably at their tables, while journalists continued recording every word. Charles understood exactly how to survive inside elite spaces. Powerful people rarely defended themselves emotionally. They redirected attention toward reputation, accomplishments, and influence. For a brief moment, Vanessa worried it might work. Then Olivia Bennet slowly stood again near the front donor tables. Her voice remained calm when she spoke, but the silence surrounding her somehow made every word heavier. "Nobody here is questioning charity work," she said while staring directly at Charles. "We are questioning honesty." The room froze once more beneath the chandelier light. Olivia stepped forward slightly beside her table. "Did Daniel Reed ever receive public credit for the speeches you built your image around?" Charles hesitated again. Too long this time. Vanessa saw it clearly. The hesitation traveled visibly through the room like a crack spreading across glass. Several investors exchanged looks immediately while reporters moved closer toward the stage. One camera flash burst brightly against the rain-covered windows behind Charles. Another followed seconds later. The atmosphere no longer resembled a charity gala. It felt like public judgment unfolding in real time beneath marble walls and crystal light. Vanessa suddenly became aware again of the dead microphone still hanging in her hand. Hours earlier, she was invisible staff carrying champagne quietly between tables. Now some of the most powerful people in Manhattan were listening because she refused to stay silent. Charles finally answered in a lower voice than before. Daniel preferred staying behind the scenes. Michael shook his head immediately. "No," he replied softly. Daniel was kept behind the scenes. The sentence settled across the ballroom with devastating weight. Nobody interrupted afterward. Nobody defended Charles immediately this time. Beneath the sound of rain and chandelier reflections, Vanessa looked around slowly at the same wealthy strangers who once stared at her with irritation when she interrupted the speech. Now many of them looked at her differently. Not with admiration exactly, but with the uncomfortable realization that the invisible waitress in the black uniform had forced the entire room to confront something they would have ignored forever if she had remained silent. The atmosphere inside the ballroom no longer felt elegant. It felt fragile. Crystal chandeliers still glowed warmly above the marble floors and luxury floral arrangements, but the emotional center of the room had shifted completely beneath the endless rain sliding across the giant Manhattan windows surrounding the gala. Vanessa Brooks stood beside the stage gripping the dead microphone while cameras continued flashing toward Charles Whitmore from every direction. Earlier that night, the billionaire controlled every eye inside the ballroom with polished speeches and carefully timed emotion. Now the same audience watched him with uncertainty heavy enough to feel physically present in the air. Charles remained near the podium beneath the golden stage lights, while his jaw tightened subtly after Michael Turner's final sentence. Daniel was kept behind the scenes. The words seemed to linger inside the ballroom long after they were spoken. Several investors avoided eye contact entirely, while journalists whispered urgently beneath the chandeliers and typed rapidly into glowing phones. Security guards near the walls no longer looked certain about approaching Vanessa. Even they seemed trapped between two realities now, the one before the recording played, and the one after. Charles inhaled slowly before forcing himself back into public composure once again. "I understand how emotionally compelling tonight appears," he said carefully while turning toward the audience beneath the stage lights. "But reducing decades of charitable work into accusations based on partial recordings and personal resentment would be irresponsible." Vanessa immediately recognized the strategy. Distance himself emotionally. Question motives. Rebuild authority through professionalism. Wealthy people inside rooms like this respected confidence more than vulnerability. For a brief moment, she feared the room might begin following him again. Then Charles looked directly toward her. Miss Brooks overheard fragments of a private rehearsal conversation. He continued evenly. She does not understand the context of Daniel Reed's role inside the foundation. The sentence hit Vanessa harder than she expected. Not because of the words themselves. Because of the tone. Calm. Dismissive. Controlled. The tone powerful people used when reminding someone exactly where they belonged socially. Vanessa suddenly became painfully aware of herself again beneath hundreds of staring strangers. The black waitress uniform. The exhaustion beneath her eyes after working double shifts all week. The service shoes hurting her feet after standing for nearly 12 hours. She did not belong in public conflict with billionaires. Everyone inside the ballroom knew it. Charles stepped slightly closer toward the front of the stage. Tonight was supposed to raise money for families struggling across this country. He said while lowering his voice into something softer and more personal. I would hate for one emotional misunderstanding to distract from people who genuinely need help. Several guests nodded faintly beneath the chandelier light. Vanessa felt panic tighten inside her chest immediately. He was rebuilding sympathy, reclaiming the room piece by piece. Wealthy donors looked uncomfortable again, not because they suddenly trusted Charles completely, but because elite spaces hated prolonged discomfort. People wanted resolution, calm, a reason to stop feeling morally uncertain while sipping champagne beneath crystal chandeliers. Vanessa looked down briefly toward the dead microphone hanging from her hand, while humiliation burned quietly beneath her skin. Maybe she had destroyed her own life for nothing. Maybe powerful people really could survive anything as long as they spoke calmly enough. Then suddenly Olivia Bennet stepped away from her table entirely and walked slowly toward the stage beneath the ballroom lights. The room turned toward her instantly. Olivia stopped several feet from Charles while rain continued tapping softly against the towering windows behind him. You keep calling this emotional, she said quietly. But nobody forced your own voice onto those speakers. Complete silence returned again. Charles said nothing immediately. Olivia continued staring at him carefully beneath the chandelier reflections. And there is something else bothering me, she added softly. You keep referring to her as if she is invisible. Vanessa felt her breath catch slightly. Olivia turned toward the audience now. This young woman interrupted one of the most powerful men in New York inside a ballroom full of strangers because she believed the truth mattered more than her job. No one moved. No one interrupted. The rain outside seemed louder somehow against the giant glass walls overlooking Manhattan. Olivia looked back toward Charles one final time. That is not emotional instability, she said calmly. That is courage. The sentence settled heavily across the ballroom, while several guests slowly lowered their eyes. Vanessa stood frozen beneath the stage lights, unable to speak for several seconds. Nobody had defended her publicly like that in years. Maybe ever. Across from her, Charles Whitmore remained completely still beside the podium, while camera flashes reflected against the rain-covered windows behind him. For the first time all evening, the billionaire looked less like a man controlling a room and more like a man realizing the room itself was beginning to turn away from him. The ballroom slowly lost its ability to pretend everything was normal after Olivia Bennet defended Vanessa publicly. The luxury atmosphere still surrounded the room beneath crystal chandeliers and warm gold reflections across marble floors, but the emotional foundation holding the gala together had cracked beyond repair. Rain continued pouring against the giant Manhattan windows surrounding the ballroom, while journalists moved carefully between donor tables capturing every expression, every whisper, every visible reaction from the people who once applauded Charles Whitmore only minutes earlier. Vanessa Brooks stood near the stage, still holding the silent microphone, while her breathing slowly steadied for the first time all evening. Earlier, she felt trapped beneath the eyes of powerful strangers waiting for her to disappear. Now the room itself seemed uncertain what to do with her. Some guests looked uncomfortable when they met her eyes. Others looked quietly ashamed. A few looked at her with something closer to respect. Across the ballroom, Charles remained beside the podium beneath the stage lights, while security staff lingered uncertainly near the walls, no longer receiving direct instructions from anyone. The billionaire's polished confidence had not vanished completely, but maintaining it now required visible effort. Vanessa noticed how often he paused before speaking, how tightly his hands clasped together between responses. The room no longer moved automatically around him. People had begun thinking independently again. Michael Turner remained standing near the center aisle beneath the chandelier reflections while reporters surrounded him asking quiet questions about Daniel Reed. The journalist answered carefully without dramatics. Daniel wanted recognition more than money, Michael explained softly. He believed truth mattered inside public storytelling. That was the entire reason he became a writer. The sentence drifted heavily across the ballroom, while several donors lowered their eyes toward untouched champagne glasses sitting beside expensive dinner plates. Vanessa looked around slowly at the room itself. The giant floral displays, the luxury auction screens glowing softly near the stage, the designer gowns and tailored tuxedos reflecting warm chandelier light across polished marble. Everything still looked beautiful on the surface, but now she could see something else beneath it. How much of elite society depended on silence? Silence from employees, silence from assistants, silence from people carrying trays quietly through rooms filled with powerful strangers. Charles finally stepped away from the podium and moved toward Vanessa directly. The ballroom immediately grew quiet again beneath the rain tapping steadily against the towering windows overlooking Manhattan. Every camera turned toward them. Vanessa felt her pulse quicken again while Charles stopped several feet away from her beneath the stage lights. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Up close, he looked older now, more tired. The performance he maintained for cameras all evening had begun slipping away piece by piece. "Do you have any idea what happens after tonight?" Charles asked quietly. His voice no longer sounded angry. It sounded exhausted. Vanessa swallowed carefully before answering. "I did not plan any of this." Charles looked toward the ballroom briefly while journalists continued watching from every direction. "That does not change what comes next." Vanessa understood exactly what he meant. Headlines, interviews, online arguments, people destroying each other publicly for entertainment by morning. The realization settled heavily inside her chest because she never wanted fame from this moment. She only wanted someone to stop applauding stolen truth. Charles studied her silently beneath the chandelier reflections. "You could have spoken to me privately," he finally said. Vanessa looked directly back at him for the first time without fear controlling her voice. "Would you have listened?" The question hung painfully between them while rain rolled down the giant windows behind the stage. Charles did not answer immediately, and that silence itself became the answer. Nearby, Olivia Bennet watched quietly beside the donor tables, while Michael Turner lowered his phone slowly beneath the ballroom lights. Nobody interrupted the moment. Nobody tried controlling it anymore. Vanessa suddenly realized the room had stopped seeing her as background staff entirely. She was no longer invisible beneath the chandeliers and cameras. Yet strangely, instead of feeling powerful, she felt deeply tired, emotionally hollow after carrying fear inside her body for hours. Charles looked away first, toward the rain, toward the skyline beyond the glass, toward the ballroom that no longer belonged fully to him. Daniel deserved credit, he admitted finally in a lower voice than before. The confession landed softly inside the ballroom, but its weight felt enormous. Several guests closed their eyes briefly while reporters immediately raised cameras again. Vanessa stared at Charles in stunned silence beneath the warm stage lights. For the first time all evening, the billionaire was no longer defending his image. He was standing inside the truth without protection. Charles Whitmore's quiet confession seemed to alter the entire atmosphere of the ballroom more than the recording itself. Daniel deserved credit. The sentence still lingered beneath the crystal chandeliers long after he spoke it, while rain continued pouring against the giant Manhattan windows overlooking the dark New York skyline. Nobody applauded. Nobody moved quickly. Even the journalists surrounding the stage appeared strangely restrained now, as if the room had crossed beyond scandal into something more uncomfortable and human. Vanessa Brooks stood motionless beside the podium, still holding the silent microphone, while the warm chandelier light reflected softly across the marble floor beneath her worn service shoes. She looked at Charles carefully for the first time, not as a billionaire standing on a stage, but as an exhausted man standing inside the collapse of an image he spent years protecting. The ballroom no longer belonged to him emotionally. Vanessa could feel that clearly now. Earlier, every movement inside the room adjusted automatically around Charles Whitmore. Donors laughed when he smiled. Reporters leaned forward when he spoke. Staff members disappeared quietly before interrupting the illusion of perfection surrounding him. But after the recording, after the confession, after Olivia Bennet publicly defended a waitress instead of a billionaire, the invisible structure holding the gala together had changed permanently. Michael Turner lowered his phone slowly beneath the chandelier reflections, while several journalists whispered quietly among themselves near the center tables. No one rushed toward Charles aggressively. No one shouted accusations. The silence itself felt heavier than public outrage would have. Charles finally looked directly at Vanessa again beneath the warm stage lights. "Daniel once told me something," he said quietly enough that the closest guests leaned forward to hear him clearly. He said people stop listening to the truth once money enters the room. Vanessa remained still while rain rolled down the towering windows behind them. Charles exhaled slowly before continuing. "I thought he was wrong." The billionaire glanced toward the audience surrounding the ballroom. Investors, politicians, media executives, celebrities, people who spent years admiring him publicly. Then eventually, I realized people only listened when the story sounded better coming from someone powerful. The honesty inside his voice no longer sounded polished for cameras. It sounded tired, human. Vanessa noticed several guests lowering their eyes after hearing him. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked ashamed. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had shifted far away from entertainment now. It felt more like collective reflection unfolding beneath crystal light and silver rain. Olivia Bennet stepped closer toward the stage while folding her hands calmly in front of her designer gown. "Then why not tell the truth earlier?" she asked softly. Charles gave a faint, humorless smile while staring toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. "Because success becomes addictive," he admitted. "And eventually you start convincing yourself the image matters more than the person underneath it." Complete silence followed. Vanessa felt chills rise across her skin despite the warmth inside the ballroom. For years, she had watched wealthy guests move through hotel spaces believing status protected them from consequences ordinary people faced every day. But standing here now, she suddenly understood something different. Power did not remove fear. It only taught people how to hide it better. Charles turned back toward Vanessa again. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. Several reporters immediately lifted cameras once more beneath the chandelier reflections. Vanessa looked stunned for a moment because she had spent the entire evening preparing herself to be removed from the ballroom, humiliated publicly, and possibly fired before sunrise. An apology never entered her imagination. Charles continued speaking while keeping his voice low and steady. "Not because you embarrassed me," he said. "Because I treated you like your voice mattered less the moment I saw your uniform." The sentence settled painfully across the room. No one interrupted him. No one pretended not to understand what he meant. Vanessa felt emotion tighten unexpectedly inside her chest, while camera flashes reflected softly against the rain-covered glass walls surrounding the ballroom. She remembered every moment earlier that evening. The looks, the whispers, the way people stared at her when she interrupted the speech as though a black waitress speaking publicly inside a room full of wealthy white strangers automatically represented disorder. Charles lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again. "You were right to interrupt me." The ballroom remained perfectly still beneath the chandelier light, while Vanessa struggled to process the sentence fully. Somewhere near the back of the room, a waiter quietly lowered a silver tray onto an empty table. The soft metallic sound echoed faintly through the silence. Outside, rain continued washing down the Manhattan skyline, while inside the ballroom the emotional distance between the waitress and the billionaire no longer felt defined entirely by power. For the first time all evening, they stood inside the same truth together. The ballroom remained suspended in a strange emotional stillness after Charles Whitmore apologized publicly to Vanessa Brooks beneath the crystal chandeliers. Rain continued washing down the giant Manhattan windows surrounding the charity gala while warm golden reflections shimmered across marble floors and untouched glasses scattered across donor tables. Nobody seemed certain how to move normally anymore. Journalists lowered cameras slightly. Investors sat quietly beneath the chandelier light. Even the hotel staff standing near the ballroom walls appeared frozen inside the moment unfolding before them. Vanessa still held the dead microphone loosely in her hands while trying to process everything that had happened since she interrupted the speech less than an hour earlier. The same room that once looked at her like an inconvenience now watched her with careful silence. Yet despite the attention surrounding her, she did not feel victorious. She felt emotionally exhausted, like every ounce of strength inside her body had been spent simply refusing to stay silent. Charles stood a few feet away near the stage while the polished image he spent years building seemed to fade quietly beneath the ballroom lights. For the first time all evening, he no longer looked like a billionaire controlling a gala. He looked like a man confronting the weight of choices he could no longer defend publicly. Olivia Bennet slowly approached the stage beneath the warm chandelier glow, while Michael Turner remained nearby, speaking quietly with several journalists. The atmosphere no longer resembled a public scandal. It felt closer to collective reflection. Wealthy guests who spent years admiring Charles Whitmore now sat in uncomfortable silence, confronting how easily power could reshape truth when nobody challenged it. Olivia stopped beside Vanessa first. "You should sit down," she said softly. Vanessa shook her head gently. "I am okay." But her voice sounded thinner than she intended. Olivia looked toward the ballroom around them before lowering her voice slightly. "Most people in this room would never risk their income to speak publicly against someone powerful." Vanessa stared down briefly at the microphone in her hand. "I almost stayed quiet." Olivia nodded slowly beneath the chandelier reflections. That is usually how silence survives. Across the ballroom, Charles listened quietly while rain rolled steadily against the giant windows behind him. The billionaire looked toward Vanessa again before speaking in a lower voice than earlier. "Daniel used to argue with me constantly," he admitted. "He said people with money become addicted to being admired." Several nearby guests lowered their eyes after hearing him. Charles continued speaking while the ballroom remained silent enough to hear the rain outside. "At first, I believed borrowing his words helped our foundation raise more money for people who needed it. Then eventually," he paused briefly beneath the warm stage lights. "Eventually, I stopped thinking about Daniel entirely." The honesty inside the confession settled heavily across the room. Vanessa looked at Charles carefully while trying to understand the complicated emotion moving through her chest now. Earlier, she feared him, resented him, felt humiliated beneath the way he dismissed her publicly. But standing here now, she also saw something unexpectedly human beneath the billionaire image. Loneliness, regret, exhaustion. Power had protected him for years, but it had also isolated him inside a version of himself built entirely for public approval. Michael Turner stepped closer toward the stage, holding his phone lowered at his side. "Daniel once told me something during our final interview," he said quietly. "He said being invisible inside powerful rooms slowly teaches people to doubt their own worth." Vanessa felt chills rise across her arms beneath the ballroom lighting. The sentence hit painfully close to home. She spent years disappearing quietly through luxury spaces carrying silver trays, while wealthy strangers looked through her instead of at her. Years learning how invisible service workers became inside elite environments unless something went wrong. Charles looked directly at Vanessa again. "I made you feel invisible tonight," he said quietly. Vanessa remained silent for several seconds while rain continued sliding across the glass walls surrounding the ballroom. Finally, she answered softly, "No. The room already wanted me invisible before I ever touched the microphone." Complete silence followed her words. Nobody denied them. Nobody rushed to comfort the room from the truth hidden inside the sentence. Several guests lowered their eyes while camera flashes reflected faintly across the rain-covered windows overlooking Manhattan. Then unexpectedly, Charles stepped away from the podium completely and looked toward the audience surrounding the ballroom. "Daniel Reed deserves public credit for every speech I used," he said clearly. "And Vanessa Brooks deserves respect for forcing me to admit it." The room stayed silent afterward beneath the chandeliers and silver rain. But this time the silence no longer felt cruel. It felt honest. Nearly an hour later, the ballroom had emptied into a strange, exhausted quiet beneath the fading chandelier lights. Most of the investors and journalists were gone now, disappearing into private elevators and black luxury cars waiting below the hotel entrance, while rain continued washing across the Manhattan skyline outside. The giant ballroom that once felt filled with applause and polished performance now looked emotionally hollow beneath scattered champagne glasses, abandoned auction brochures, and half-melted candlelight reflecting softly across marble floors. Vanessa Brooks stood alone near the towering windows overlooking the rain-soaked city while holding her folded waitress apron against her chest. The adrenaline carrying her through the night had finally faded, leaving only exhaustion behind. Her feet ached after the double shift. Her hands still trembled faintly from the moment she interrupted the speech. Everything felt quieter now that the cameras were mostly gone. Real again somehow. Behind her, hotel staff moved silently through the ballroom collecting glasses and clearing tables beneath the warm, fading lights. Some glanced toward Vanessa with careful expressions before returning to work. Others avoided looking at her entirely. The entire hotel would probably still be talking about tonight by sunrise. Vanessa stared through the rain-covered glass toward the Manhattan streets, glowing below in silver reflections. Hours earlier, she entered the hotel through the employee entrance carrying catering trays while worrying about subway delays, overdue medical bills, and whether she could afford another week of medication for her mother. She never imagined the night would end with one of the most powerful men in New York apologizing publicly beneath crystal chandeliers. Yet standing here now, she did not feel triumphant. She only felt tired, deeply tired, the kind of exhaustion that settles inside people after carrying fear for too long. Soft footsteps approached slowly behind her across the marble floor. Vanessa turned slightly and saw Charles Whitmore standing several feet away near the darkened stage. Without the spotlight and cameras surrounding him, he looked smaller somehow. Older, human in a way he never appeared earlier that evening. His tie was loosened now. The polished certainty inside his posture had disappeared completely. For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke, while rain tapped softly against the giant windows surrounding the ballroom. Finally, Charles looked toward the city lights below. Daniel used to stand by these windows after every gala, he said quietly. He hated rooms like this. Vanessa remained silent while listening. Charles gave a faint, tired smile that never fully reached his eyes. He said rich people clap hardest for pain they never had to survive themselves. The sentence settled softly into the empty ballroom, while staff members continued cleaning tables quietly in the distance. Vanessa looked down briefly at the folded apron in her hands. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked gently. Charles stared toward the rain sliding across the glass. "Because tonight you reminded me of something I stopped believing a long time ago." Vanessa waited quietly beneath the fading chandelier light. Charles finally looked at her directly. That truth still matters, even when it costs something. The honesty inside his voice no longer sounded performative. There were no reporters left to impress now. No audience waiting to applaud redemption. Just two people standing inside the silence left behind after power failed to protect someone from themselves. Vanessa studied him carefully before answering. Truth always costs something. Charles lowered his eyes briefly after hearing her words. Neither of them spoke again for several moments while thunder rolled softly over Manhattan in the distance. Then Charles reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. "Daniel wrote this during his final year," he said quietly while handing it toward her. Vanessa unfolded the page slowly beneath the ballroom light. At the top was a single handwritten sentence. "Invisible people usually carry the heaviest truths." Vanessa stared at the words while emotion tightened unexpectedly inside her chest. When she looked up again, Charles had already stepped back toward the darkened stage. The billionaire paused one final time beside the silent podium where the entire night began. Then he walked away quietly through the empty ballroom without another word. Vanessa remained standing beside the giant rain-covered windows long after he disappeared. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath silver rain and blurred streetlights, while inside the ballroom the chandeliers slowly dimmed one by one until only soft reflections remained across the marble floor. And standing there alone in her black waitress uniform beneath the final fading light, Vanessa Brooks no longer looked invisible at all.